Welcome to Coffee and Contemplation. I'm Robin, and today we'll be discussing Chapter 3, The Pollywog. Today's coffee is Dublin Roasters Highlander Grog, and Dublin Roasters is a local roaster. I have selected this coffee before in season 1, but I like it a lot. It is a staple in my pantry, and I'm drinking it this time from a Luke's Diner mug. This was a friend. This was a friend from a gift of mine. This was a gift from a friend of mine, two friends of mine, Brian and Karen, who I work with, and they. I believe this was a Christmas or birthday gift. I honestly don't remember which, but I drink from this a lot because I am very much a Gilmore Girls fan, and I quite ridiculously almost only drink coffee from this mug. I find it feels odd to drink tea from a Luke's Diner mug just because of the association with Gilmore Girls. For anyone who's unfamiliar, it's very much all about the coffee on that show. So now, whether or not drinking Highlander Grog is particularly fitting, I don't know, but it's good, and that's what matters. So thanks, Karen. Thanks, Ryan. And now that we have acquired coffee, let's proceed with contemplation. So our cold open features Dustin trying to sneak into his house with something caught in the ghost trap, presumably whatever it was that was in the trash can from the end of chapter 2. And when we meet Mrs. Henderson, who I really, really like, and she's played by Catherine Curtin. Again, it's excellent casting. I mean, we've already seen her once briefly in chapter 1, but I really like her. She's great. I really like the relationship between she and Dustin. It's different from, the other familial relationships in the show, mother-son relationships, but you can tell that they are very close. Curiously, it seems as though she's a single mom, like Joyce. Dustin evicts Yertle the turtle from his cage, and in goes soon-to-be-named D'Artagnan or Dart. A lot of this season seems to get critique over the fact that this relationship between Dustin and Dart feels maybe not out of character, but in this beginning sequence, it occurred to me that what I think they may have been going for is something along the lines of like E.T. That this, especially with the musical score being what it is, it feels like they're going for kind of that sort of vibe, but that it takes a very dark turn. And, and maybe that was their attempt, their intention, that's the word. But that it just really didn't quite work on execution. And that could be completely wrong, but that's definitely what came to my mind. Thinking about the music specifically, the musical score, it's a great track. But it has a very warm, very like cozy kind of like, kid-friendly, they are bonding kind of tone to it. And it was like thinking about adding different musical score under this scene, something more like what we hear later, like in the AV Club room, for example, when, not even just like when Will starts putting the connection in, figuring out that there is a connection between Dart and the Upside Down, but even just some of the other music in there, it's a little bit more sinister. It's a little bit just more like uncertain. I think even something that more mildly different would have drastically changed how this comes across. Gaten Matarazzo is playing it very sincerely. I don't think his performance is what tends to stand out as being the part that's wrong. I think part of it is the structure and a lot of the just character choices that Dustin makes. This opening sequence helps lend some, not very much, but some believability to where we proceed from here. I don't think it was enough, but I think it does a lot more than people realize. I think without this moment and without some of like just Matarazzo's expressions and like how he plays this, I don't think it would work at all. Not to say that it works terribly well later, but this bit certainly helps. Title sequence, and I don't know that if in episode 1, I don't think I mentioned that Sean Astin's name is in the credits now. I don't know if his name was in the credits then. I didn't go back and check, but he is here, and if his name has been featured in the past 2 episodes opening credits, then I sincerely apologize, Mr. Astin. Thank you very much for Bob Newby. Coming out of the credits, we see Elle and Hopper's first meeting. For the time being, I'm going to stick to my theory from last episode, which is that the hunter, or whoever the dude was who ran into Elle in the woods, that he was a lab guy, that Elle just knocked him out and didn't kill him, so he went back to the lab, told someone there, and either Hopper got wind of it on his own, or Owen specifically went to him and said, hey, the girl who used to be here, the experiment of Brenner's, yeah, someone thinks they saw her. Keep an eye out for us, please, if you don't mind. And that's how Hopper knew to start trying to draw her out. But if there's another theory out there that I'm just not aware of, please, by all means, share. Flashing forward, Hopper lures a still cold shoulder giving Elle out of her room with the triple-decker Eggo extravaganza. He asks her if she visited him again last night, which I think is kind of cool that Hopper is aware of the fact that she is continuing to use her powers, which she is, and it confirms that, yes, she's doing this repeatedly and she's practicing and growing. But her resistance to him, her friends don't lie, the fact that they have their fight later, it makes sense that it's seeded from this, like that there's so much that's building up. Dustin goes to the library. This is where we get our curiosity voyage. Same librarian, by the way, as last season, not a recast. Bob and Will in the car. And this is when he gives Will the advice about standing up to his sort of inner demons, or that's all we think that it is. That's all Bob thinks it is anyway. And tells him the story of Mr. Baldo, and under any other circumstances, this would be perfectly sound advice. You know, I don't know that it would be good advice for everyone, but it's certainly a good suggestion. It's sound. It's this idea of like being able to stand your ground and, you know, you're literally telling your inner demons to go away. I think that there's something to that. I think sometimes that is a good method, but still no psychiatrists or psychologists here. But it seemed like sound and certainly good intention, good-natured advice coming from Bob, but unfortunately very bad advice. Lucas tells Max about the public knowledge version of what happened to Will, why he's called Zombie Boy, and that is directly followed by the sequence in the class where Mr. Clark talks about the steel rod case, Phineas Gage. And I really like, though, the way that Sadie Sink plays these moments, the fact that her interest continues to not seem like it's from a morbidly curious place or insensitive place. Asking not because she's like overly concerned about Will. It's just to borrow Heidi's phrase, what is your deal, sir? I think it's very reasonable for someone who's starting to bond with a group of people to kind of be like, okay, there's clearly information here that's really important and really significant and it's affecting all of you. What is the deal? Like, it's not creepy and it's not insensitive. That's not an easy thing to do, I think, for most people to, in any situation, to remember sometimes, especially not knowing like what actually happened, to be able to have the sensitivity to not overstep and not ask the wrong questions. Like, that's hard just in life about normal things. But especially given the context of what's going on here, very nicely performed by Sadie Sink. I give a lot of props to both her and to Justin Doble, the writer on this episode. And Sean Levy, who directed it, because I do think that there's a lot of really good direction here. There's another particular moment of like really awesome writing between Bob and Joyce, which we'll get to shortly. Dustin arrives late to class and he's like, we have to meet in the AV club room, and he includes Max in this. And that's when Mr. Clark, calls him to attention. And I just love the little, yes, my lord. At the police station, Hopper and Callahan and Powell they're working on tracking the rot. I find that their reactions, to him being a little overly hostile is, I get it. Off he goes to the lab to confront Owens. I do love Flo holding out the keys for him. In the meantime, though, we get a flashback to Hopper bringing Eleven to the cabin. And I especially love right at the beginning when he walks in, her kind of kicking the door frame. I mean, she's doing it to kick off the snow, but it also feels like one of those things that you'll see kids do sometimes where they mimic the adult. It says in a really, really understated way that she already trusts Hopper. There's a certain connection already forming. Again, it deepens the believability for the full spectrum of how deep their relationship, essentially as father and daughter, will go. Hopper then puts on You Don't Mess Around with Jim by Jim Croce. And while he dances, you kind of get the look from Elle, like, he's such a dork. It's really cute. And then that leads into the montage of them cleaning up the cabin. From there, though, we proceed into montage number 2, in which Hopper, in the flashback, establishes the ground rules, the we're not stupid rules, intercut with present-day 11 breaking these rules. Really love the editing through here. It's a very, very nice way to kind of wrap up all of the flashbacks, because basically you're up to speed at that point. It's like that's the full scale of it, and to have that intercut with what's happening presently in such a parallel way, I really dig that. It was a very nice editing choice. And at the end of that montage, Elle ventures out on her own, even though she says, I'm not stupid. When she makes this choice, I remember watching it the first time feeling like, what are you doing? I certainly, but I think a lot of us are very invested in Elle as a character by this point, and her taking this risk while, and on the one hand, it does feel like she's very capable. The fact that she has been practicing, her powers are growing, it seems like the lab isn't out there adamantly, actively looking for her. But, at the back of your mind, you're also like, well, but Murray was there, in the very beginning of episode 1, and is it stupid to go out and risk this? And maybe it is, but there's also, I found watching it now, the real risk is her being found and then potentially getting other people in trouble, putting other people at risk. I don't really think, even at this point, this early in the season, I don't necessarily think she'd have been in too much danger to her physical person in this first occasion going out. Probably she would have only come across like 1, maybe 2 people, not an entire army. It would not have been a repeat of the van chase, for example. I think she's probably powerful enough that she could have at least gotten away. At the same time, I buy her making this decision because A, she's been cooped up. I think a lot of us have a much more familiar association with the idea of being quarantined for a year than a lot of us did at the time of this release. But also, I think there's a sense of, she is a child. She's a kid. She's preteen, teenager, depending on where you put those delineating lines. And kids do stuff like this. And what made me think of this specifically was comparing this to something that I just watched within the last few months, which was the Netflix series Sweet Tooth. And there are a number of moments in that show where I get why this child makes certain decisions. There's a level of ignorance and also a level of just, he's an even younger child than 11, but it's a lot more frustrating because it's like this character does have certain information. He's been told certain things, but he breaks these rules anyway. And he doesn't have certain advantages like Elle does. And so while there is that level of kids are going to do shit like this, I find that with Elle, it's not as frustrating. This really feels like we've built to this pinnacle moment. I guess what I'm getting at is it feels earned. I had to give it a little more credit than I ever have before. Over at Hawkins High, Billy and Steve face off on the basketball court. I assumed practice at first, but then this is also intercut with scenes during the day, with the kids at school. So I presume it's gym class. If you haven't noticed it, the ADR on Billy's line, "Then you turned bitch," it's bad. The sync is just... And Billy is really wagging his tongue around at Steve, and mostly I don't see it in a particularly sexual way, but kind of. Go back and specifically look at some of those shots. It's weird. It's out there, literally. Nancy arrives, and they step outside into the alley outside the gym to talk, and she is upset, understandably, because he apparently just didn't show up at her house to take her to school, which I'm guessing is their routine. There's a lot happening in this exchange. For him to just not show up at her house, it's a little shitty. Not as shitty as just abandoning her at a party, but when she's drunk, but still, I mean, it's not great. It's not a good look. Him saying, "I just figured Jonathan would take you," in kind of a casual way. The tone is very almost resigned. On the other hand, he's clearly indicating that he thinks, at the very least, he thinks Jonathan would have shown up to take her to school, but I think the indication is that he expected Jonathan to just be there in the morning already. So clearly none of that went away. I mean, even the fact that he says that was your other boyfriend. Is this just something he's been living with, that he's just been thinking has been going on? And he's just kind of been accepting that because he doesn't want to lose her, he's that desperate. That's kind of sad. It doesn't justify his actions, but wow. She tries to, I was drunk, Steve, and he says, okay, then tell me. And she can't say that she loves him. I've said it before, but I love the performances from these two. And I think this may be one of the reasons why I think, not just me, why a lot of people really like that character and really like the growth of him as a character, is because he manages to find this level of humanity, even in, the shittiest of moments. This is sort of the vibe that I think Heidi and I were talking about in season 1. The surrounding circumstances are different, but the fact that it's ultimately they're having the same exchange, but it's leveled up a little bit because it's not even, I'm not with Jonathan. It's, I can't say I love you because I'm not in love with you anymore. But regardless of whether or not she's in love with him at this stage, I do think she still cares about him. And that, I think, is what Natalia Dyer is definitely playing. But yeah, overall, kind of a bad day for Steve. And I almost said King Steve, which I don't think actually applies to him in the second half of this scene, because I think despite all of this, like between the face off with Billy and then the conversation with Nancy, I think that hurts deeper, that hurts more. And I think that says a lot about him. Meanwhile, over at Hawkins Middle, the kids meet in the AV club room, and we are introduced to D'Artagnan properly, or Dart, as Dustin says, when Dustin is explaining all of the science-y information about pollywogs and about all this research that he's done, especially since a lot of it is directly to Max. I like that it doesn't come off as mansplaining. It feels just like, this is the research I've done, and I'm just conveying it to everyone. I just happen to be kind of looking in your direction. And I think the proof of that is the fact that this is not all that different from how we saw him explain things to the boys last season. And I just like that this is sort of this is like this continuation of their sort of collective nerdery. We're keeping in touch with that aspect of season 1. But meanwhile, during some of the like more lighthearted parts of this scene, Will recognizes Dart. And this sequence is cut really, really well. The edit is fantastic. It's presented like a memory, the way that Will might experience it. You know, the cuts are jagged and they're staccatoed and jarring, and the frame flips, you know, the way that Will or any of us might experience a traumatic memory like that, being very disoriented. And part of that recognition is the sound. Will recognizes the sound, and it sort of links his awareness up with ours, that he recognizes it from the Upside Down and from his association therein, and that's what launches into so much of the flashback. Excellent editing here. Shout out to Kevin D. Ross, the editor on this episode. And from there, we cut over to Bob and Joyce having their lunch together. I have to admit that while I really appreciate the writing sort of in the second half of this scene, a lot of the stuff at the beginning, the dialogue from Bob specifically, feels a little ham-fisted. A lot of him saying, like, I just like your boys and your whole family so much. It really has that too good to be true vibe to it, which I think contributes considerably to why I didn't totally trust Bob or trust the show with Bob at first, because it just was like, something about this just doesn't feel right. This doesn't feel real. And it is real. I mean, but even on rewatches, something about it just still feels just a little, like I said, just a little ham-fisted, a little clunky. And I think the reason for that is the fact that we really want to get this established. We really want to make this clear. And we don't have time because we got all this other stuff that we're needing to spend more time on. And I would agree that there's other stuff that needs slower development. The way that Bob brings up the fact that the JVC, his camcorder, is slightly busted. He never says outright that he's upset that the camcorder was damaged. He says there were some scratches on it, and it still works fine. You know, he plays that very much like, I mean, so this is the case, and it's fine, but I'm not worried about that. And he says, and I saw these kids being pretty terrible to Will, and that feels incredibly sincere. And that's clearly what the whole reason he brought this up. Just the way that a lot of that is conveyed is really beautiful. Of course, Joyce is like, was it these kids? I want names. To which he responds, well, you know, he thinks about it. He's like, well, they're about the right age, so maybe. And that is a beautifully subtle piece of writing, because while, I mean, I know for the longest time, I don't think I even caught the fact that he says that. My focus, like probably everyone else's, is focused on Joyce and her going, I'm gonna kill him. She thinks to say, was it these specific children? Like, Bob's gonna know that? Well, he's been around long enough, not just to know Jonathan and Will. He knows their community. He knows the neighborhood kids. That little exchange is so subtly brilliant. It does so much. I was really impressed by that. At the lab, Hopper confronts Owens. This is a problem, and you're going to deal with it. The power dynamic really does shift between Owens and Hopper. Like, at the beginning, Owens is very dismissive. By the end of it, Hopper's like, no. Convince me. We've seen that Hopper has been playing it safer. He's been a little more restrained with the lab. I mean, he says all of this. Like, I've been playing by your rules because I have because our interests are the same, and because I have an investment in this town, and I want to keep the town safe. But now you're not holding up your end of the bargain. It has that sense of like, I'm not asking, I'm telling. It's moments like this that I love from Hopper, the fact that he's able to stand in complete conviction and not back down. And especially right on the heels of that scene with Joyce and Bob's thing about you punch back. I get the sense that Hopper I mean, we know that Hopper is the type to punch back. And so it's not to say like, oh, he's a better match for Joyce than Bob is. I don't subscribe to that belief, but I do think that she does have a lot in common with Hopper, that they are more similar. And I do think that there is a level of like Owens realizing it's not just that he's intimidated by Hopper. I do think that there is a sense of like, this is something I need to be concerned about. Despite the fact that later in the sequence where they're in the field and the lab techs are all out there getting their samples and he's sort of like, whoa, and the smell, you know, I still feel like there's a lot happening between them where they do actually have mutual respect. Just Owens doesn't show it very often. This scene is followed by Jonathan and Nancy having lunch together. I mean, you could make an argument, I think, that by having this sequence follow Joyce and Bob and then Hopper and, you know, with a potential linking between those two scenes, having this sort of be the third link in that chain, Jonathan and Nancy are more on the same wavelength, as Heidi talked about, how you see them working together from so early in the series. I could see that being like an additional underscoring of the fact that there's just more of a level of commonality and compatibility between Jonathan and Nancy and Joyce and Hopper. That said, I don't think Bob and Joyce don't work. I think that they work in a way that Steve and Nancy do not. But in that scene with Jonathan and Nancy, she's clearly asked him, before we arrive at that scene, what happened at the party. And Jonathan tells her that Steve asked him to take Nancy home. When did that happen? I mean, ultimately, I enjoy this scene, and I'll take it at face value. I always have before, but I find that the closer and analytical, you know, perspective that I take on this whole deal really bothers me. What happened at that party? You know, maybe we're in unreliable narrator territory here, but I don't like the fact that we don't have a clear answer. Like, are we being led to believe that after Steve passed Jonathan at the party, Jonathan followed him to be like, hey man, you all right? Like, where's Nancy? What happened? Then he said, she's drunk and can you take her home? And if so, I would have liked some indication that that's what happened, because as it stands, we have no canonical or textual knowledge that indicates that that's true. So then that begs the question, is Jonathan covering for Steve? And if that's the case, why? What possible reason does Jonathan have to go that far out on a limb to cover for Steve? Like, unless it's just because, well, he doesn't want to see Nancy unhappy, so he doesn't want to reveal to her that the guy she's going out with was a real dick about that. Like, what happened? I don't think that Steve's reaction in the scene prior to this in the alley, I don't think that implies that at all. He says, that was your other boyfriend. So it really gets muddled and weird, and maybe it doesn't mean anything, and maybe I'm way overthinking it, but again, considering this is the group that I find really compelling and the most interesting, and this isn't something we need to be unclear about. Like, why are we being vague about what happened at the party? I would just like to know, because I think it says a lot in any direction about not just Steve, but Jonathan too. But the last thing that happens at the end of the scene between Jonathan and Nancy is Nancy gets an idea by seeing the guy with the Walkman, and she says, do you want to skip fourth period? Which shifts into catching back up with Elle. She comes upon the mother and her young daughter, and I guess I lied because we do get a flashback here with Hopper and Elle, but this isn't so much about, well, how did she end up in Hopper's cabin? This is just a flashback between the two of them since she's come to be there, and it's clearly still early in that time because her hair is still short the way that it was when she first got there. He's reading her Anne of Green Gables, apparently. I didn't know that, but Heidi did. There's a pause in that reading though, because she asks if she has a mother, and Hopper tells her that she's not around anymore. I don't think that Hopper tells her this in a way that feels mean or feels like he's trying to shield or hide anything from her. As far as his understanding goes of the situation, Terry Ives isn't really here anymore. Her mother is basically gone. Did 11 deserve to know the full story? Yeah. So maybe I guess it's not so much that Hopper isn't trying to like hide information from her in the sense of, I don't want her to go looking for her mother. It's more of there's just a lot of heartache to be found there, and that this might not be the right time or place to give her that information. Was that his call? I don't know. There's a lot of baggage there, but I think ultimately I don't think he was doing I don't think he said what he said from a irresponsible place. Coming out of the flashback, though, 11 proceeds forward, and she kind of scares that mother in the backyard with her child. She gets information on where the school is, and off she goes, pulling a pretty solid disappearing act. I think there's a little bit of trickery happening there with how wide that shot is, and the fact that Elle is nowhere to be seen. Elle's fast. I don't think she's that fast or silent. She rolled a super duper high stealth roll apparently on that one. This is when Joyce tries to watch the footage from the Halloween night. She sees the bullying that takes place, and you can watch how it affects her, but then she catches the mind flare in the static, and she compares the drawing that she just did and the drawing that Will did, and they're a match. And the idea that you can see it in the static, and there's this like crossover. I really, really like that. We catch up with the boys at school and Max, and Dustin is about to present Dart to Mr. Clark when Mike and Will rush in, and they grab the ghost trap before Mr. Clark can see it, and they run back out. This is after Will having told Mike, not the full details on screen in real time, but we've seen him approach Mike and say, so about Dart, they basically have it out. Dart is from the Upside Down. Max is not part of that conversation. She's left outside. They're able to talk a little bit more openly about it. A lot of conversation, a lot of debate has been made over Dustin's actions here from this point on. His decision to refuse to hear and refuse to acknowledge and incorporate the fact that Will recognizes that Dart is from the Upside Down, that he forms this weird bond with it. It's messy. It's not handled terribly well. I think this is something that probably looked better on paper than it did in execution. I think they were going for the E.T. Bond sort of thing, that it's like, well, but what if E.T. but actually evil? Given the kind of person that I think Dustin is, the fact that he went to such lengths to protect Will last season, it's like, why does this little thing matter so much? I mean, I will say that the fact that he does bond with it does actually pay off in a big way. I mean, essentially it's one of the biggest reasons that the kids and Steve are able to get out of the tunnels at the end, which makes just a lot of this feel worthwhile. That's really important. It does have payoff. That said, as much as it doesn't bother me the way that I think it bothers a lot of other viewers, it's the fact that he hides Dart. He makes choices that just, to me, they don't totally track. Not so much when I was watching it, but when I was thinking back over this stuff. First, I thought of Frodo and Gollum, and I think other people may have talked about that. But really what I found myself thinking about was Old Yeller. Now, for anyone who doesn't know what Old Yeller is, it's a Disney movie that will break your heart 1,000 times over. It's probably on Disney Plus, but if you watch it, proceed with caution. It made me think of that because I guess minor spoilers for Old Yeller, if you care. You have this family's mother and two sons. The one son is a teenager-ish. There's the younger brother in the middle of this prairie, this farm, and the dog kind of becomes part of the family. A wolf breaks onto the farm. Old Yeller fights him, and the wolf has rabies. There's some concern about but he seems okay. So they're like, but no, we have to kill him. Travis, the older of the two boys, says, look, why don't we lock him in a pen for the next several days and see if he is affected, because maybe he won't be. Maybe there's this chance that he won't be affected. And so for a few days things look okay. Yeller seems to be perfectly fine. And then one night Travis goes out and brings some food out to him, and he's just not right. He's growling. The energy is just wrong. You can just tell. But Travis goes inside, and I don't remember if it's the mom or the younger brother, but one of them asks, so how is he doing? And Travis has this very defensive attitude. He says well, how would you like it if you had to be penned up all the time? I think the younger brother might go out, open the gate or nearly open the gate and to this pen where Yeller is, or he goes in and almost gets hurt, something like that. Travis has to face the fact that this is it. I'm not going to go into what happens after that. The point is, there is some similarity here, I think, to what Dustin is doing and how Dustin is responding to Dart. I think there's a defensive-ness that reminds me of how Travis reacts to Yeller. It's the sense of he knows what they're saying is true. He knows that this is a problem. He knows that this is not something that they can just ignore. And frankly, the rest of the party isn't going to ignore it. Mike has made it very clear where he stands. Like, no, we have to kill this thing because it's from the upside down. Even being an animal lover, I asked Heidi, I said, how would you react in this situation? And she said, well, first of all, I wouldn't have taken the thing into my home because you don't know what its diet is, you don't know where it came from, you don't, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Like, there are tons of possibilities of how this could harm me or someone I love. The fact that the Hendersons have Muse, it's like, that's an issue. Even though, yes, this dart is technically a living thing, the dangers here are just exponential, and there's no way to even know how exponential they are. I don't think that Dustin isn't aware, like, not acknowledging that. Well, no, he does kind of try to deflect it, but I think it's from this place of he's in denial. He just really doesn't want to admit it, and that's what reminds me of Old Yeller. The difference, of course, being that in Old Yeller, you've spent a long time with this dog, you know, both as the audience and the characters, even longer, really, because movie time. And I think, though, where some of this might be coming from, there's been a lot made of the fact that, like, well, maybe it's because he wants to impress Max with it based on the conversation that he has with Steve later. I think it's the fact that Dustin is, like, in the scene earlier, he says, like, I've discovered a new species. I think that's probably the bigger thing. He's like, this is a chance for me to, like, really, not even like just like, well, be rich and famous. I think it's just a question. I mean, he jokes about that with Max sort of like in the background as they're walking away. But I think there's this sense of, this is a way for me to be an individual. This is something that I've discovered, and like, I think this is really cool. And this isn't just something that, like, here's this ghost trap prop I made. Isn't it cool? No? Okay. This is, like, as far as Dustin's concerned, like, quantifiably a big deal. And I think that might be playing into this. And I still don't think this justifies the fact that they find Dart and Dustin hides it. But as far as, like, preferences go, it really doesn't bother me. I don't need this to be different for me to enjoy the second season. I also, just as a side note, I really think it's cute that when Dustin is showing Mr. Clark the ghost trap prop, Mr. Clark just thinks that's cool. Like, he's perfectly ready to just be encouraging of, like, hey, cool, this is this, like, mechanical engineering thing that you did. Like, I mean, Dustin is an inventor, right? So that's actually probably come up before. And it's like, this is the newest thing I've invented. I just thought that was neat. Nancy and Jonathan calling Mrs. Holland, and that the lab overhears this call. There's some waffling between them of, like, do we really want to do this? Which felt like a nice little callback to the bit with the cutting their hands at the end of last season, so that was cute. Hopper gets the call from Callahan. Basically, the L has been sighted, and so he's like, stay right there. We're gonna have to wait till next episode to see the payoff from that. And we also get a quick cutaway to Billy and some girl at his car, and he does exactly what he said he would do. He doesn't wait for Max. He also says, don't call her my sister. The way he pulls the car back, Heidi said it, and I agree. I would not want to ever, I could not imagine being in a car with Billy. Just, no. Elle arrives at the school, and first she sees Mike's bicycle. I love that we get this little pause for that, and then she goes into the school. I'm a real sucker for, like, the sequences like this where you have, I mean, we'll just go ahead and be real about it. The romantic leads, like, keep missing each other. Like, I love that. Especially the first time through, you're like, she's right there. He's right there. You know, even as much as I love the way this plays out, it's still one of those, like, but what if they had found each other here? Like, how different would the show have been? And not just in terms of Mike and Eleven, like, how would that have affected everything? Like, what would the ripple effect have been? But during this, we also get the scene between Mike and Max. I really appreciated this. I remember on the first time through of her just being able to be like, what is your deal, sir? And I don't even think it's necessarily the fact that Max is a girl. I really don't. I mean, I think an argument could be made that that's what it is, that it's like, well, she's this new girl, and, you know, it's the inverse of what happened with Mike and Lucas last season and with Eleven. But I don't read it that way. I read it the fact that it's just, she's a new person, and that it, by her having to potentially be let in on a lot of this information, it means they would have to tell her everything. They'd have to talk about it. As someone who is dealing with grief, I lost my father in 2020. And so I know that for me, one of the ways that grief has manifested for me is I find that for a long time, this is only just now starting to shift, but for a long time, especially when we were still in lockdown, I didn't even want to think about my dad because it was too hard, and I didn't have an emotional support system all that readily available because I was living not with my family, and I was very scared because of COVID. And so I was distancing from my family that was local, just was very much alone through that period. But even when I would look at pictures or anything like that, it was too overwhelming to handle. And I don't know if that's a universal experience. Some people have shared with me that they have experienced that. I mean, I feel like I saw some of that in Mike before 2020, but I really felt like I recognized it now, seeing that I think he's just like, I just don't want to go back down into all that. I don't want to have to go walk through it, live through it again. That's one of the reasons why I don't see his behavior as just emo. I think there is a level of depth to it, that is a manifestation of grief. He can't talk to his mom. He can't talk to his dad. He can't talk to Nancy. I get the impression that he feels, based on other stuff we've seen, he doesn't feel that he can talk even to Dustin and Lucas about it. It's just this amalgamation of like all these different things happening at once. And for Max to come in, it's just, no, don't wanna. Just no. Just kind of a no across the board. I don't even know you. It's like, it has nothing to do with you. But I think that even separate from 11 witnessing he and Max in the gym, I like that we get a glimpse of them starting to be friendly towards each other. I don't get it as flirtatious. I just don't. I very much see that scene as just, she's like, come on, you're clearly going through some deep shit, which I think anyone can probably pick up on, even if this was just a friend that he had that he was close with that moved away, whether that was a girl that he liked or just a person that he was really close friends with. That in and of itself is upsetting and can be traumatizing, especially when you're young. I think she interprets it that way. And so I think her kind of going like, hey, but you can't do this. I could be in your party. Of course that's a thing. Like, it feels very good-natured. It feels very much like she's just trying to like joke him into a good mood. And it works. And I think that like then when she falls, we'll get to that in a second, that him helping her up, it's like, that's the real Mike. So I really, really like everything that's happening in this sequence. And I think it helps establish them as friends pretty early. But we do have 11 at the door, and in this sequence we get a glimpse of sort of her turning toward the dark side. Her knocking Max off her skateboard like that, her head could have hit that floor, could have snapped her neck, or it could have caused like a much, much more serious injury than her just being a little bit sore. The fact that 11 doesn't even think about it, she's just like, I don't like that you're getting close to Mike. And I do think it's coded as she's jealous. She's worried that there is romance flying. But not unlike the shot with Jonathan seeing Steve and Nancy at the party, I think there might be a little unreliable narrator happening here. She is seeing it in the same way that Jonathan saw Steve and Nancy, where like she's seeing what she thinks is romantic, but it's not, you know, and maybe it is. Maybe it is slightly flirtatious. Again, I don't see it that way, but 11, I think, does. Again, it's really nicely seeding this very early indication of what will happen in the Lost Sister episode. I mean, granted, 11 could have done a lot more damage if she'd wanted to. We have seen her do a lot more damage. So she is still somewhat restrained. But again, I think a lot of what this season ultimately does is it's sort of allowing 11 to explore what are her limits? What are her boundaries? Where does she draw the line? And she's never had to do that before. And so this is sort of I think the first occasion where we see her take an action that wasn't actually necessary. In terms of it causes someone harm. The look on her face, it almost makes you not care because it's so sad, especially since she knocks her off and then Mike helps her up, and that only seems to kind of make it worse from where Elle is standing. Mike then says, what happened? And Max says, it was like this electromagnetic pull or something like that. Like something about being magnetized. Mike has been levitated by 11 before, so he knows what that feels like. So you see him think, wait a minute, you know, he runs out of the gym, can't find her, but over in the main office, one of the secretaries gets a call from Joyce Byers, and apparently this is very common based on the way she reacts and mouths the word Joyce to the other secretary. Despite that, though, this secretary is very nice. She goes, oh, you know, she actually engages with Joyce. Like, oh, Mr. Clark, no, I saw him leave, so maybe there is no AV club today. Yeah, that's not foreboding at all to Joyce. She gets in her car and starts driving off very, very quickly. And at the same time, we see Will in the bathroom where he finds Dart. Will is super, super duper spooked, and I don't blame him one bit. He radios the others to tell them that Dart has been found, that he's in this bathroom, but before the others can get there, he runs out of the bathroom and runs right into an episode. Basically chased out onto the field by this just darkness. It's not really in the shape of the mind flayer until it gets out into the field. And Will tries to stand up to him, and it really, 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 really doesn't work. There's all this great setup. Like, it's definitely preparing you for what comes next. And I had forgotten that that's where the episode ends. It does not end with Joyce arriving. I was so sure that it ended with Joyce going, "Will, wake up!" And it doesn't happen till next episode. So that was a really, really big cliffhanger. I was not ready for that. I don't think that this would have worked as well in like a broadcast episode by episode release format in terms of just it being so abrupt. I think it would have felt like, because it does feel a little bit like the episode just ends. It doesn't have as much conclusiveness to it. I mean, it definitely makes you want to keep watching, but I think that a lot of other episodes have achieved that without having to just stop. This one kind of feels like it just stopped. Not one of their strongest endings, but it's not one of the strongest endings amongst a plethora of really good endings, so we're okay here. Final thoughts, this was a really great episode. All the stuff with the party is still very, very confusing. By the party, I mean the Halloween party, not the D&D party. I really like all the stuff with the kids. I've said a lot about the Mike and Max dynamic. I just continue to be really fascinated with how these characters continue to evolve. I like that we're in chapter 3 and already we've got a lot of stuff picking up, but it's still kind of a slow burn, and I enjoy that. I'm continuing to enjoy that. I think that these first 3 episodes, with the two exceptions of the stuff with the Halloween party being kind of murky and then the stuff with Dustin being a little clunky and messy, I really just continue to believe that this is a really strong start to the second season. I think that it still holds up really well. Really looking forward to chapter 4. And with all of that said, this is going to conclude our contemplation on chapter 3, the Pollywog. If you've got comments, thoughts, suggestions, questions, join the conversation. Coffee and Contemplation is available on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. And if you've been enjoying what you've been hearing, please consider leaving us a review. The podcast is available on Spotify, Stitcher, Apple Podcasts, anywhere podcasts are available for free. Thanks again for listening, and until next time, over and out. Hopper gets the call from Murray, not from Murray. I hope that dog barking isn't going to be a problem. I'm not looking something up because I forgot. I also don't overthink things. I don't know what you're talking about. Oh no! I didn't finish my notes! That's a problem. I'm just going to take that completely from the top.